All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I am Rico Rutia here with my co-hosts Brian Pfeiffer and Jerry Scapaciulo. And today we're getting caught up with some labor news. We have news about illegal teacher strikes in Massachusetts. We have news about the Teamsters, the NFL players unions, updates on Caterpillar, and much more. We'll get into all that right after we check out this little snippet from Charles Mingus's song titled Free Cell Block F, 'Tis Nazi USA. Charles Mingus is one of our favorite artists around here, and one of the things that we love about him is that he would occasionally attach political titles to compositions after writing them in order to call attention to a particular issue. So here's a little snippet from Free Cell Block F, 'Tis Nazi USA by Mr. Charles Mingus. All right, welcome back everyone, and the first thing we're going to do today, and the only thing we're going to do today, is report on the news. In preparation for our podcast, I like to go through the press releases of different unions and see, what's going on, in particular with the international bodies of the unions. And so in preparation for today's podcast, I checked out press releases by the National Education Association, AFSCME, the Teamsters, the United Food and Commercial Workers, the UAW, Unite Here, and SEIU. And that actually gave me something different to report on. What I can report on now is that of those 7 unions, all with the exception of the Teamsters, had press releases commenting on the State of the Union address. And not just commenting, but really praising Joe Biden as a pro-union, pro-labor president. And, hats off to the Teamsters for focusing so much on organizing and strike news. They didn't partake in that. But I just wanted to put that out there because, one, no one's asking for those press releases. Those aren't a requirement of a union. No one's required to write that up or even start up that conversation, number one. And number two, something that I did notice was that the press releases left out any mention of the railway strike, which I think is glaring and significant. Perhaps the one exception that I did catch offhand was Unite Here, who had written a previous press release urging elected officials to facilitate a solution. But being a labor podcast that offers both labor news and analysis, I have to put something out there for the consideration of our listeners, and if not for your consideration, perhaps for the reassurance. The way I see it, strikes are litmus tests. If someone crosses a picket line, that tells you something about their politics. If someone steers you away from workplace organizing, direct action, strikes, and instead steers you towards legislative politics alone as a means to address your grievances, that tells you something about their politics. And of course, when the President of the United States goes on national television saying that the railway strike is unacceptable, quote unquote, that tells us something very glaring. As we reported in our August 27th episode that discussed the UPS strike, the Teamsters taught us that you can gain more from being on strike for 2 weeks than you can from negotiating with politicians for several years. Strikes aren't easy, of course, but the Teamsters reminded us of this lesson in 1997. So I just wanted to share that because, that's what I saw in my search for the news today, going through all these press releases, was a lot of praising and a lot of admiration for Joe Biden, and just wanted to put it out there again. The Teamsters taught us a lesson in 1997. We did the 25th anniversary episode of the 1997 strike. We did that in August of last year. And, I encourage people to listen to that. Just because that's one of the first things that came to mind after I saw these, press releases praising Joe Biden. So, I also know that Teamsters have their negotiations coming up for their contract this year, and that Brian is going to speak to that a little bit, if you could, Brian.
Thanks, Brother Rick. Yeah, the Teamsters are in beginning to form or have formed their various bargaining committees locally and nationally. This is happening as we speak. We just wanted to raise this. There's the rank and file members, of course, are in a fighting mood across the country and building their strength along with community participation and with their loved ones and families and communities across the country. We, of course, at We Rise Fighting support the Teamsters and demanding a just contract at UPS. The current contract expires July 31st. So keep a lookout for this. A lot of information and updates can be found at the Teamsters Facebook page and the national website. And we will continue to monitor the situation and update listeners as we find out more information. So solidarity with the Teamsters and demanding a just contract at UPS.
Now, next we got Jerry with some updates from the Supreme Court. What's going on over there, Jerry?
Well, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear a lower court ruling regarding actually, I believe it was a Teamster strike, which seeks to penalize unions if they go on strike. If we go on strike and the result of that is any kind of financial loss or damage to the employer, then this court decision shows the possibility of indemnifying the striking union financially for any costs borne by the employer for certain damages. I'm not sure if that would include loss of revenue, but certain kinds of problems that are caused by a strike to the employer. So that's something to really watch out for. Also, we're looking at a proposed law in Iowa, which would remove a lot of protections for underage workers working for subcontractors for major corporations. Rick, I think you know something more about that than I do. So
yeah, we were chatting about that before jumping on. I was thinking of offering that up for the news, but this is the most updated information I can offer. I read an article from February 6th saying that a bill would be proposed in Iowa that kind of changes things up as far as labor laws for young people between the ages of 14 to 17. It kind of outlined how they were going to be participating in the workforce, being able to take jobs that would keep them working until like 9 p.m. on weekdays during the school year, until midnight during the summer. But the part that stood out most to me was that the employer isn't liable if the young worker gets sick, injured, or dies on the job. So that's a huge thing. So that was going to be the newsworthy piece. And the only reason I held back on offering that was because I didn't know the update on the bill, but that's what was proposed.
Even if we don't know the letter and all the points of the law, I think what we can see in this proposal for this law is the crisis confronting capitalists today with a shortfall of workers, where the labor force seems to be shrinking, and workers are not so willing to work for the lousy wages that people have been getting over the years, and so seeking to delve into the workforce and throw young workers into the labor force might be seen as a sort of a desperate move when a lot of jobs are going begging these days. And this is a long-term problem for capitalism, but to take it out on young workers and to remove the protections that we thought, the child labor laws that were passed decades and decades ago would protect. It's just another attack on the working class, and it's a labor union issue. It goes way beyond whether or not these young workers are organizing or can organize or whatever. It's a worker issue, and more we have to distinguish the importance of workers as the working class, and not just for our labor union privileges and strikes and supports that, of course, we have to support. but 90% of the labor force is not unionized. So we have to be thinking about a broad class struggle going on in this country, and ways for labor unions to get involved into it. And I might have something more to say about that later on, but I want to throw it back to y'all.
Yeah, but for real, I mean, just the fact that we're talking about, child labor laws or young people between the ages of 14 to 17. I mean, part of the reasons is that we have child labor laws in this country is because of unions. So even be opening that up, really, I think the end game should be for these young people to not have to work, for their needs to be provided until at least graduation, for capitalism to be opening up for, yeah, no, come on, man. You're taking us back 100 years, man. But that's the barbarism and the savagery that is capitalism.
And a great Russian political scientist, Lenin, over 100 years ago, wrote that there is an irreconcilable conflict between labor and capital, and that the only reason why we have the capitalist state is to try to make the irreconcilable reconcilable, which it cannot do. It is impossible to do that. And so more and more, I think capitalism is coming under attack, but itself as an economic system that must be done away with in order to really ensure and guarantee, the rights of the working class. I'll say one more thing about that, and then I want to stop talking. But here in Boston, there is a movement to organize labor unions in the community against the increasing neo-Nazi attacks on Black workers and trans workers in, reform-minded, super liberal Massachusetts, where last year there were hundreds of such attacks, according to the Southern, the ADL and other organizations that monitor hate crimes in the United States. And labor unions are showing an interest in signing on to a petition to demand that more police and work and that be done in order to stop these attacks. But more than that, there is an organizational effort underway to unite transgender and Black people in Boston, being pushed by the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and Pride at Work, to build a coalition to fight these attacks here in Boston, which are, it seems like every other day, someone is being bashed, or there are bomb threats going to major hospitals and so forth, that dare to have clinics that support transgender health. So it's a rising tide of neo-fascism here in across the country. There in your Midwest, Brian and Rick. So I'm sure you've seen enough of it also. But I think all we have to do is organize. For want of organizing, do we not have the power that we need? And we are going to organize such a coalition in Massachusetts.
Okay, I got a update from Caterpillar negotiations. Every week I've been trying to keep listeners up to date on what's happening at Caterpillar. And let me also backtrack just a little bit, speak to why we're covering Caterpillar. About a year, maybe year and a half ago, comrades, I can't remember exactly when, but John Deere was up for negotiation, right? John Deere, maker of tractors and other farm equipment. The workers there were negotiating their contract. And followed of course by CNH Industrial, which we've been covering and got involved with, and that was one of the reasons that we thought it would be a good idea to get involved with CNH, was just to make sure that the contracts in that industry remain reasonable or don't get completely smashed, or whatever the case may be, because in labor, in the world of unions, one contract negotiation, one contract, one collective bargaining agreement will set a precedent. In other words, it'll set an example for what future contracts will look like. So if the contracts, if it's a good contract, that's a good precedent to work off of. So that was one of the reasons that we decided to offer ourselves for the Racine struggle. And one of the reasons I also wanted to update you on the Caterpillar struggle. In preparation for this, I checked out the company website, which just said that the subcommittees were still in negotiations. And I also checked out the UAW Local 974 website. And since I last looked at the UAW Local 974 website, it has posted a February newsletter. And the newsletter reads as follows. Greetings, brothers and sisters. By the time you are reading this, we will be 3 to 4 weeks into contract negotiations with approximately that much time remaining until the March 1st deadline. I want to be optimistic about negotiating an acceptable agreement with Caterpillar, but it's difficult to be. I know that the business climate is ideal right now, and I know that Caterpillar has struggled hiring quality employees the last couple of years. I also know that the UAW has been very successful negotiating excellent agreements with other big companies recently, so it is time for Caterpillar to do the same. If Caterpillar refuses to do this, our only recourse will be to call a strike and withhold our labor, and the only way this will work is for all our members to not cross the picket line. I understand that everyone is going to make their choices, but we can't expect to get the best contract possible without the potential of making sacrifices. Now is the time to demand a fair contract, and we can only do that with complete solidarity. Stay safe, and in solidarity, Randy Dial. And as a reminder, UAW Local 974 has overwhelmingly authorized a strike at Caterpillar, and that strike, as the newsletter mentioned, could get started as early as March 1st of this year. All right, next up, as far as labor news, I have Brian with news from Railway Workers United.
Okay, thanks, Rick and Jerry. So our friends, the Railroad Workers United Coalition, continues organizing, especially after we have just seen the horrific East Palestine train derailment in Ohio. And this, of course, was due to railroad barons' greed, and it increases the urgency to organize safety on the railroads. This week, the Railroad Workers United will have a very important meeting for worker solidarity. And in an email for this meeting, the RWU states, in part, after the tentative agreement was passed last fall, we released the RWU statement, the Democratic Republican 1-2 punch to rail labor. And this is a quote from that statement that the RWU, Railroad Workers United, put out, which can be found at their website. This 1-2 punch, quote, this 1-2 punch from the two political parties is despicable, according to RWU General Secretary Jason Doring. Politicians are happy to voice platitudes and heap praise upon us for our heroism throughout the pandemic, the essential nature of our work, the difficult and dangerous and demanding conditions of our jobs. Yet when the steel hits the rail, they back the powerful and multi-class Class 1 rail carriers every time. RWU understands that this fight for justice will continue in the coming months and years. The rail carriers are too powerful and are a scourge to the national economy, according to steering committee member Paul Lindsay. They need to be taken into public ownership and run in the interests of workers, shippers, passengers, and the nation, not a handful of wealthy stockholders, end quote. The Railroad Workers United believes that railroad workers need to explore options other than the existing two political parties, since neither appears to have their backs. Thousands of individuals and over 200 organizations of working people had signed on to our open letter last fall. It is not just rail workers, but the entire working class that has gotten attacked by the two-party system, with continuous declines in life expectancy, living standards, and increases in deaths and suicides. The climate crisis continues without stop, and the duopoly of the Democrats and Republicans continues to increase the military budget as countless workers suffer at home. So this week, Wednesday, February 15th, there's going to be a very important nationwide call led by the Railroad Workers United to discuss tactics to move forward after they were betrayed by the Biden administration and the Republicans, as they say in the statement, by both capitalist parties. And this will be a very important meeting, and we will find out more information, and we will be reporting that on the developments that We Rise Fighting as we move forward.
Right on. Thank you, Brian. I would also like to report from the Los Angeles Times. Wanted to read directly from there because this article is concise and offers one bit of information that could be useful to some listeners. This article is about LA bus drivers, food workers, teachers' aides, all give the union okay to call a strike if talks fail. The article reads as follows. Members of the union that represents most non-teaching employees in Los Angeles schools, cafeteria workers, custodians, and teachers' assistants have overwhelmingly voted to allow their leaders to call a strike if negotiations don't lead to an agreement. The 30,000 workers represented by Local 99 of SEIU, including bus drivers, campus security aides, and gardeners, all essential to operations in the nation's second largest school system. The union is seeking a 30% wage increase plus a $2 an hour quote-unquote equity wage adjustment for all, which would especially benefit hourly workers making the least. The union is negotiating for salary terms going back to the start of the 2020-2021 school year. The ballots were tallied Saturday, and the outcome was no surprise. A strike authorization vote is a standard pressure tactic, and the approval does not mean that there will be a strike. But the union leadership now has a strong endorsement to call a strike at its discretion. The size of the yes vote, 96%, was introduced to send an unmistakable signal about worker dissatisfaction to the LA Unified Board of Education and Superintendent Alberto Calvajo. Now, excuse me, the part I wanted to take out of that, for the benefit of some listeners, maybe people who are newer to the labor movement and unions and how some of this stuff works, was the part that read, the approval does not mean that there will be a strike, but the union leadership now has a strong endorsement to call a strike at its discretion. So when you hear about a union authorizing a strike, that's what it means. They're not necessarily saying they're about to go on strike right then and there, but they're letting their union leadership decide when it is time to strike. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm not saying any of that. I'm just letting some of our listeners know that that's how it is when they read that in the news. All right. Up next, we have some international news. What's happening with French unions, Brian?
All right. With French unions, staged third day of general strikes to oppose pension austerity. On January 31st and February 7th, hundreds of thousands of workers and youth stayed away from school and work to make a political statement on the current economic crisis. A broad coalition of French workers and youth have answered President Macron's policies with a series of general strikes and mass mobilizations. Again, on February 11th, another day of demonstrations took place, filling the streets of Paris and other major cities throughout the country. And this comes from fightingwords.net, an article by Abiyami Azakiwe. And as we've reported previously on We Rise Fighting, these similar actions are taking place in the UK and will continue. Also, in tandem with this, the International Longshore Workers Union, Local 10, and we interviewed Brother Clarence Thomas, a retired worker from there, will shut down the docks in Oakland and San Francisco on February 16th. And these actions, these international actions are important. There's many, many lessons for workers here in this country. And we know as the capitalist crisis deepens, there will be calls to cut Medicare, to cut Medicaid, to cut Social Security, and other very critical social safety net programs. Right now, a lot of the pandemic safety nets are being cut. The Biden administration is cutting a lot of the benefits, ending a lot of the benefits that we had throughout the pandemic. So besides just reporting on these events in France and the UK, there are many, many lessons such as general strikes, direct actions that workers in the United States could adopt and be in solidarity with and learn from the workers in Western Europe and other locations. So solidarity to our fellow workers there in France. So back to Rick.
All right, and this is actually reporting from Massachusetts. The title of this article is Massachusetts Teachers Find Illegal Strikes Are Quote Unquote Worth It. And it was written by NPR in Boston. And the article reads as follows. Educators in Woburn spent 5 school days on strike before they achieved a deal with the district Sunday night, the latest in a series of such labor actions in the past year that have generated massive attention, some fines for unions, and in each case, a contract agreement. In May, Brookline educators struck for 1 day before reaching a contract agreement. Teachers were on strike in Malden for a single day in October, the same month that Haverhill teachers went on strike for 4 days. And last month, Melrose teachers voted to strike, then quickly agreed to a deal with the city to avert actually shuttering schools. Massachusetts is one of dozens of states where public employee organizations are prohibited from striking, and advocates for years have been unsuccessful at convincing a critical mass of lawmakers to support changing the status quo. The Massachusetts Teachers Association targeted an end to the ban as one of its priorities for the 2023-24 session, arguing that a lack of ability to strike legally puts educators at a disadvantage in contract negotiations with districts who are able to stall talks. In the meantime, unions have opted to proceed with strikes, aware that such action violates state law and could carry financial consequences. Now, excuse me, I just wanted to put that out there because that's a subject that we've discussed on this podcast before. Sometimes the strikes have to be illegal. What it comes down to is, in the world of labor laws, it's not a matter of if something is legal or not, but how the workers can get away with it. So that's the real discussion because, all the effective stuff in labor organizing and union organizing, the general strikes, the wildcat strikes, the secondary boycotts, the sympathy boycotts, the sympathy strikes, the secondary strikes, all that stuff is illegal, or you have to jump through 1,000, bureaucratic and administrative legal hoops to be able to pull it off legally. So that's why it's easy to come to the conclusion that if you need to go on strike, it's got to be illegal because that's how the laws are written. But sometimes strikes is what makes sense. So just wanted to put that out there because it carries that lesson as well. Next up, as far as news, I have Brian with some news about the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference.
Yes, thanks, Rick. Our friends in Cuba, People's Cuba, again, are showing the way on how to be humanitarian. They have teams of medical doctors and other personnel right now in Turkey and Syria with the horrific earthquake there, the aftermath, which has already killed over 22,000 people. And as the U.S. funds neo-Nazis in Ukraine and invades and bombs and menaces countries like Venezuela and China and sanctions countries like Venezuela, Cuba, again, is showing how to be humanitarian around the world, sending teams to Turkey and Syria, as well as many other nations across the country who need assistance medically and otherwise. These topics and many others will be brought up at the International U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference, March 11th and 12th in New York City. Listeners can go to uscubanormalization.org to find out more information. And the Cuban Confederation of Unions and many unions in Cuba have always been a supporter of these types of activities, such as humanitarian assistance. So solidarity with that conference and the People's Cuba, and thank them again for their international solidarity that continues.
All right. Thank you, Brian. A little bit of news from Temple University. This one's going to be quick because there's mostly just a point to this. We have NPR reporting Temple University is withholding tuition and healthcare benefits for more than 100 working graduate students who are on strike for better pay. Graduate students took to the picket lines on January 31st after over a year of stalled negotiations between Temple and the Graduate Student Union. The union, which represents about 750 TAs and RAs, is proposing an annual base wage of $32,800, up from the current of $19,500 average salary graduate students receive. Temple's proposal raises the base salary for graduate employees to $22,500 by the year 2026, according to TUGSA, which I presume to be the Graduate Workers Union. Now, I brought this up, because again, more of the barbarism in this, to remove people's healthcare benefits when they're on strike. I mean, as we've discussed on here, that could be a death sentence to some of these workers. How can this not get more coverage? How are people not more appalled or, just taking direct action, burning shit down? I don't know. But when you take people's health care away, man, I'm taken aback by how that's just becoming a thing and no big deal. That is a big deal on this podcast, at least, and that's why we're reporting on it. So that's why, amongst other reasons of solidarity, That's why I decided to present on this piece, to let y'all know that graduate student workers at Temple University are on strike and their health benefits have been cut. So going to keep you posted on that. But that's what I found out in preparation for today's episode. Up next, we have Brian with an update from the NFL Players Union and Starbucks. What's going on with those, Brian?
Thanks, Rick. Before we report on that real quick, we want to announce, in solidarity with the LGBTQ and trans community in particular, we at We Rise Fighting know that trans rights are workers' rights, and there will be national protests in Washington, D.C., March 31st and April 1st. It's called the Trans Day of Vengeance. That's a Trans Day of Vengeance, March 31st and April 1st. April 1, April 1st, there will be a march there in Washington, D.C., and more information can be found at the Trans Day of Vengeance website. And exciting developments today at the Super Bowl, Starbucks Workers United had a press conference with the NFL Players Union before the Super Bowl today. And as we've discussed on We Rise Fighting, this is the kind of solidarity that we're going to need to win. According to Starbucks Workers United, the NFL Players Association turned up to support Starbucks workers on the eve of the Super Bowl in Arizona. As Starbucks continues to invest in union busting rather than bargaining in good faith with union workers, you might add firing workers, among other atrocities, members of the community came out to speak on behalf of workers everywhere. Starbucks Workers United would like to thank everyone, and especially the NFL Players Union, for having their backs as they push for a truly equal voice in the workplace. And they had special thanks to rally speakers, the NFL Players Union president, J.C. Treader, also NFL players, spoke President Liz Schuler of the AFL-CIO, AFL-CIO director Fred Yamashita, and many Starbucks Workers United workers there at the press conference. And this is the type of solidarity we're going to need as we move forward. And we also like to add and thank the tech workers, the production workers, the electricians, IATSE workers, the workers who make the beverages and the food and everything that goes in, and of course the cultural workers are members of unions at the Super Bowl, and it would definitely not be happening, that Super Bowl, which makes billions of dollars in profits for the rich, without many workers, and many of those workers are union. So thanks, Rick.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Lots of stuff in labor news this week. It was hard to just narrow it down to a handful of articles. I had to leave out an update from Portland. I reported a couple of weeks back that the city of Portland workers were ready to strike, and they just signed an agreement. So that's the best update that I could offer with that. Also found an article that, I think it was an op-ed that spoke to Google workers and the tech industry, basically saying, hey, are y'all not ready to organize yet? Like, union's still a dirty word. So all types of stuff happening. We here at We Rise Fighting, we're not doing anything too magical here. My process is to go and check out the press releases and the newsrooms of the different unions that we want to talk about. Some of the major unions here, I go on Google, I type in unions and strike and labor and strike. That's how we get our news. So if you want to follow up or, generate some of your own news to talk about in your workplace, that's how simple it is. We just pick and choose some of the more interesting and significant stuff that we think comes with extra lessons for labor analysis, theory, or history, as we like to report. So that's the essence of tonight's news. Thank you for joining us this week. We will have more news for you again next week. Have a good night, everyone. Solidarity and love to all.